Okay, welcome everybody to this presentation about an introduction to developing cybercrime capabilities and strategies. This presentation is probably going to take about 30 to 40 minutes. You're going to hear from myself, Rob Harris, and my colleague Greg Francis, and we'll do proper introductions about us in a moment. But today, the aim really is going to be to give you an overview. So the key points that we're going to discuss are going to be around the understanding the need for action. Why is it? What is the threat? What are the grounds for change? Why do we actually need to do something differently? We'll give you an overview of what the UK has done, and in particular, there's a strategy called the 4Ps, which we will cover in much more detail as we go through, which gives you sort of an idea as why you need the specific strategy, gives you a breakdown of the various elements, the importance of having a prevention programme, which is the piece that Greg will talk in great depth about, and of course really a breakdown around what those various elements are going to be. And then the final part of it will be just around understanding some of the guidelines that CREST have developed along with myself and Greg. I've authored one of them, which is establishing an effective law enforcement cybercrime unit, and Greg has authored the other around how to establish a cybercrime intervention programme, and we'll sort of cover the various elements in that today. So who are we? My name's Rob Harris. I'm a cybercrime subject matter expert and a consultant on the subject. I've got over 30 years experience in law enforcement as a UK police officer. I've worked for a number of establishments and organisations, which you can see on the screen there. My service started way back in the late 1980s when I joined Nottinghamshire Police as a young police officer. Suffice to say that back then technology had very little to do with crime at the time, so I witnessed really firsthand over the next decade or so after that, as the World Wide Web and the use of technology really started to bite, what the impact was on crime. And much of that service was spent in investigative roles around serious and organised crime. I was involved in finance investigation in the very early days, and so I was involved in a lot of fraud and financial crime. And then towards the back end of my service, sort of the last decade or so, I became involved with digital forensics, which then morphed over into cybercrime, and I witnessed firsthand the sort of rise or so that sort of came up with the strategy, the way the UK started to develop its capabilities around cybercrime. I was very fortunate then towards the end of my service to become involved with the National Police Chiefs Council, who set standards for UK policing, and I worked alongside the National Cybercrime Programme and helped to introduce those strategies and capabilities at a local, a regional and a national level. I actually retired as a police officer in 2019, but I've come back, still do some work with the NPCC, and I also work as a subject matter expert and consultant, and do some work with Greg around pieces that we sort of do jointly together.
Thanks for that, Rob. So my name's Greg Francis. Rob's given you just a quick introduction into how we know each other through our time with UK law enforcement. Just a quick overview of my background. I'll talk more about the cybercrime offender prevention program after Rob has given you an overview of this, how to implement the unit. But my background started quite differently as a route into law enforcement. I actually started as a fairly young magistrate about 30 years ago, and in the UK, you have lay magistrates who are effectively representatives of the locale that you live and work in, who are able to provide adjudication on all types of crime. Actually, 90% of crimes go through the magistrates' court, and I started performing that role when I was fairly young, from 28 years old. I then got a flavour of law enforcement and found myself working initially in fraud investigation for the local municipality, and then subsequently working for Her Majesty's Customs and Excise, where I was a specialist investigator dealing with serious crime. I did that for a number of years, and then moved into the UK's first national law enforcement agency, the Serious Organised Crime Agency, which the name is on the tin. That's what we looked at, serious organised crime, and that was my introduction to cybercrime. I changed from investigating offline crime to effectively online crime that affected the UK, and then subsequently transitioned into the National Crime Agency, the UK National Crime Agency, and found that with my experience as a cybercrime investigator and also working within the judicial system as a magistrate, that the element of prevention that came to the fore when we went to the National Cybercrime Unit within the NCA was actually an interest of mine that I felt I could really add value to. And that's where my career finished within UK law enforcement. I now, over the last 2 years, am now a consultant, focusing on cybercrime interventions, and I'm currently working as a consultant for the Dutch National Police, helping them establish their cybercrime prevention initiatives. So that's me, and I'll hand back to you, Rob.
Thanks, Craig. So why is there a need for change? You know, this is a really fundamental part of the issues that we're going to cover today. Why can't you just carry on doing what you've always done? So this is a really, really important thing to understand, that actually when you think about where cyber and technology has taken us, there's been an exponential rise in the threat, and it is multifaceted. You know, the threat comes from all different angles now. If you think about the way that society has gone and the way that we as individuals now operate, both business and personally, we've just had it ingrained within our lives, which means that all of us are potentially vulnerable, both professionally and personally. You've only got to do a simple search on the internet and you'll find a whole number of horror stories around the sort of impact and the danger that you're going to get through cyber. I think over the last week or two, some of the top stories that have been in the news just now, which is sort of impacted, are things like attacks on critical national infrastructure. You know, our own health service in the UK suffered some impact about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and then just very recently there was an attack on a French hospital which has caused problems over there. So it doesn't take much really to figure out that actually the danger here is quite substantial. It is here, it is now, and it is present. The problem that we've got with that is that it is very underreported and still quite misunderstood. So even a decade on from the first fledgling bits of cyber capability within UK law enforcement, there's still quite a misunderstanding around what the threat actually is, what the size of it is, and how to go about it. As I said earlier, do a simple search on the internet and you'll find that it is huge. Everything agrees it's big. You'll get different figures depending on what sort of things you're looking at, but all agree that it is quite a large problem. There's just a couple of bits there that I've put on the slide for you to see. In 2021, the UK had a 54% increase in fraud and cybercrime. It now becomes, in the UK, the most common type of crime. If you put those two categories together, the most common type of crime that you're actually likely to fall victim to. That was backed up by a recent study in the US, which estimated that more than half of Americans had experienced some form of cybercrime. So it's clearly now the most common crime that you're likely to be a victim to. But that last point on there, the vast majority of this does go unreported. Various reasons. Some of it is very, what you might class as low key. You might see it as not important, but there are also other reasons which, you know, become deeply ingrained within society and also business and things like that. So all of that actually equals that, well, traditional law enforcement isn't going to work. There's no way that you can just produce another team, another squad, or try and sort of consume it within your own particular workload. It just will not happen. You cannot arrest your way out of this. And you know, the point that I've made at the bottom there, that law enforcement doesn't have all of the answers, and it doesn't. You know, there's a lot of industry out there, there's a lot of experts out there that do not work in law enforcement but face the barrage of this day in and day out, and are actually at the very sharp end of what is happening. This is where law enforcement needs to start to work collectively. They need to start looking at partnerships. They need to start thinking about different ways that you can begin to tackle this problem. As I say, you can't arrest your way out of it. There's no way that you're ever going to do this in a traditional manner. So what does that lead us to then? Well, it leads us to strategies. It leads us to actually having to scratch your head and think, how can we do something different? how can we approach this in a different way? What are different methods of being able to do this? And in the UK, we came across a 4P strategy. I'll talk about that in a little more depth as to the sort of history as to where it came from. But what that was about really was that it was a fresh approach. It was about thinking, how can we begin to tackle this problem from all different directions? Going and slapping handcuffs on somebody is going to be almost impossible in every single occasion with cybercrime. I spoke before on a blog with Greg when we were talking about the way that policing has changed. And when I was a young detective, one of the first things that I was taught was the investigative triangle, where you look for the link between your offender, between the offender and victim, between the location and the victim. As soon as you start throwing in cyber, well, your investigative triangle's out the window. How can you look at a location when it's global? How can you look at relationships between victims and offenders when actually the offender is targeting 250,000 victims at a time? You know, it is a really, really difficult thing to try and do in a traditional way. So that's where the fresh approach really is needed. You need to think about having a very, very specific strategy just for your cybercrime threat. It's got to be holistic, it's got to be wide reaching, it's got to involve a lot of people. You know, you can't just think, well, law enforcement's got these answers, we're the law enforcement, we're the police, we're whoever. As far as an agency is concerned, that means that we're the ones that are going to do this. Your strategy has got to think much, much wider than that. And that point that I make there about being adapted by all aspects of a government's law enforcement capability is really important. This has got to be top to bottom. You've got to have, at a governmental and national level, a will to do this. And that's where the buy-in has got to come from. You have got to have this strategy in place and ingrained, not just through law enforcement, but through all parts of government, all parts of society, and you know, the push from senior figures, the push from influential people cannot be underestimated. So I talked about the 4P, we've mentioned the 4P strategy. So we've used the 4P model against a number of threats for quite some time. The history of it actually comes out of counter-terrorism, where the original concept came from. That was used later in serious and organised crime, and now has been adapted for cybercrime and the cyber threat. And the 4Ps are protect, prepare, pursue, and prevent. And that's where it came from originally. So this is the UK's serious and organised crime strategy back from 2013. So this is 9 years ago when this was published. It's a bit difficult to read because the graphics they used weren't the best. That's government documentation for you. But you'll see there on the left-hand side, you have your 4Ps: pursue, prosecuting and disrupting serious and organised crime; prevent, preventing people from engaging in serious or organised crime; protect, increasing the protection against serious and organised crime; and finally, the prepare, reducing the impact of serious and organised crime when it does occur. And as you work your way across the page there, the top two help to reduce the threat, and the bottom two help to reduce the vulnerability. And overall, that far right arrow helps to reduce the level of serious and organised crime. So that was the original strategy that was first published 9-10 years ago. So what does that mean for us then? So when the UK government, and Greg mentioned it earlier, Serious Organised Crime Agency and later the National Crime Agency were first implementing cyber strategies, which does date back to sort of 2011, 2012. It goes back well over 10 years now. That strategy, that 4P strategy, became a very important aspect of their debate. And they decided that actually you could move this across to the cyber threat very easily. And this is what they came up with. So again, sticking with the 4Ps, the protect side of it was about increasing protection against your attacks. It's about having messaging tools, tactics, making targets more resilient. Means that if you fall victim to an attack, it's less likely to have a successful outcome. And those are, you know, about putting strategies in place and having the sort of push around things about password advice, two-factor authentication, all of the things which, you know, kind of come second nature to people in IT, but actually as a victim or in policing or in law enforcement, we don't necessarily think about. The prepare aspect of it, reduce the impact when it does occur. Now, saying when it does occur, and I'll choose my language purposely when I say that, is that you cannot completely stop every single cybercrime. It is never going to happen. We have to live in the real world, and we have to accept that there will be attacks continuing, and some of those will end up being successful. However, have the strategy that says that if there is a successful attack, how do we make sure that we reduce this impact? And this is where prepare comes in. That's to say that if it does happen, what are you going to do about it? A lot of it is aimed at business, because clearly that's where some of the bigger impact happens, but it also is just as relevant with public as well as. And I've put that, the word in there, it's to improve the resilience of the public and businesses. So what happens when you fall victim? Have policies, understand what are you going to do, exercise it, have regular backups, all the same again that we think about when you talk to IT people, incident response tactics, all the stuff you'd expect to have in place if and when an attack happened. But prepare is an interesting one because when I first became in this world, became involved in this world, I previously had been involved in what are called in the UK local resilience forums, LRFs. Now these LRFs have been in place for a very long time, and what they are is all aspects of government and government agencies planning together for disaster. And they would plan for what if there's a big flood, what if there's a major fire, what if there's civil unrest. But the one thing which they never planned for was, well, what if there's a huge cyber attack? And of course, this is where the prepare side of things falls in. So we did a lot of work very early on with the local resilience forums to say, let's start putting cyber and cyber attacks in here so that your prepare aspect is covered. And we've been very successful in getting a lot of agencies and local government authorities to become involved in that. The third one that I've put on this slide here, pursue, this is the traditional policing bit. This is about prosecuting and disrupting cyber criminals. This is about having sufficient capabilities in place to investigate, to identify, pursue and prosecute offenders, and come up with tactics that will actually start to disrupt the way that these crimes start to happen. So known and emerging cyber threats, the known criminals. As I said, you can't do this in a traditional way. We'll speak about that. That's what my guide is particularly about, but you do need to have a different approach to it. The fourth P was Greg's domain, so I'll hand across to Greg for the prevent side.
Thanks, Rob. There's going to be elements I'm going to touch on that Rob has mentioned, and you'll understand the rationale of it as I go through the understanding around the implementing cyber offender prevention programs, because with this 4P approach, prevent was very much a unique phenomenon within cybercrime. The UK was the first country to really develop a prevent program, and the rationale for it was mainly around the national focus on cyber dependent crime, which in a nutshell is, for those who are focusing the cybercrime resources, law enforcement resources on technical crimes such as hacking, development of malware, development of things like viruses and Trojans, and the individuals in organized criminal groups that actually were able to develop those resources. So it was more about identifying and interdicting against those who developed those tools alongside those who could use those tools. And that focus of the National Crime Agency, National Cybercrime Unit, who had the remit to develop a prevent program, meant that there was a immediate recognition that there were a disproportionate amount of people under 25, and too often under 20, and even so under 15, who were committing serious cybercrime that came to the attention of the highest levels of law enforcement. And this became quite perplexing, but also the focus of the offender prevention program. So the understanding of how these young people came to the attention of national law enforcement was really key to the focus of the prevention team that was stood up within the National Cybercrime Unit. And the key was how can we build in interventions and initiatives that keep individuals and groups away from serious cybercrime. So it was decided fairly early on that we had to understand the human behaviors and the motives behind cybercrime involvement, mainly, again, cyber-dependent crime. We had to develop and implement deterrence, diversions, and disruptions. And we had to prevent reoffending and raise the perception of risk. Rob has alluded to the fact that we can't arrest our way out of cybercrime, and never a truer word can be said with the volume of people and their location across the criminal digital landscape. So we had to develop a way of preventing that traffic, not just moving into the criminal arena, but also progressing into cybercrime, and that became the emphasis of the Prevent program in the UK. But prevention, interestingly enough, has always been a core component of policing, particularly modern day policing. It has been, in many respects, one of the key pillars of policing. And when the concept of modern policing was developed in the early 19th century by Sir Robert Peel, the principles that he outlined that determined police, and even till today, emphasize very much on the effectiveness of policing being measured by the absence of arrests and the focus on prevention of crime and disorder. And what's become clear over the decades since that concept was pushed forward and promoted, is that the prevention element, although justifiably focusing on victims, actually that victim focus wasn't necessarily the best fit for a prevent 4P approach, because the victim element was accommodated around the protect component of the 4P approach, and the prevent one needed to be more focused on exactly what UK national law enforcement were focusing their resources and emphasis on, which was primarily the cyber-dependent crime, and of course the young people who were disproportionately being represented in those areas. So as that prevention rationale has progressed into the 21st century, within cybercrime, it now within the UK focuses on identifying and stopping individuals progressing into cybercrime. But where the progression is not compromised by the interventions by law enforcement, then there are other opportunities and other tools and techniques that can be used to actually degrade and disrupt those who become more committed to cybercrime. And I will talk about that in a moment when we talk about how the guide focuses on the 4D approach. But what we can see is that the criminal justice system, as it stands, not just in the UK, but across so many jurisdictions, actually doesn't build in mechanisms for dealing with individuals who have technical skills and abilities to ensure that there is a capability to rehabilitate and also to prevent reoffending, which are component parts of our criminal justice system and which dovetails directly into my experience and skills as a magistrate. And so this emphasis is also very much a component part of the guide to recognize that if we keep looking at the prosecutorial end and not stopping the traffic coming into cybercrime and not going back into it, then we're just going to continue making work for ourselves. So the prevention program is there to facilitate prosecution by building in interventions and initiatives that provide anybody who goes online with an informed position on how they can take their trajectory across the criminal landscape into either legitimate use of their skills and abilities or illegitimate criminal use. They will know the implications of both, and that's what the prevention program tries to do. putting individuals in a position to make an informed choice about how they use their technical skills and abilities. And we can now see that manifesting quite acutely, not just in the National Cybercrime Unit in the UK, but now in the Netherlands and a number of other countries within Europe who are taking on this more nuanced approach to cybercrime and it consolidating their conventional law enforcement approach to tackling the problem. So what we had is that we had tremendous flexibility in the UK to develop the concept for prevention. And what we did, we spoke, we managed to galvanize and identify the individuals and groups who had come to the attention of cybercrime law enforcement and have them talk to us through what we call behavioral debriefs. We actually spoke to them not about their offending, but actually how they got into cybercrime, their socio-economic background, their interest and stimulus for getting into the digital world, and identify the pathway. And the last slide talks about the pathway and how we actually identified the lure of gaming and the specifics of aspects of gaming, like the modification of games and the cheating on games, which came out in interviews, really stimulated the interest of individuals in their early stages of moving into the into the criminal community online. And this this understanding of how to actually modify and develop their own gaming cheats provided them with a sense of value and significant challenges that gave their sense of esteem a real lift online. The continual challenges and the peer group ratification of their skills and abilities meant that within a very short period, they found themselves moving into more technical aspects of the digital landscape, the programming, the coding, the writing of scripts, the understanding of how the back end of technology works. They soon found their aptitude for this area being one that enabled them to actually start to understand how to hack, and unfortunately illegally hack. And with the absence of any regulation and monitoring in that journey, they obviously at some stage came to the attention of law enforcement at the sharp end. So this pathway that we can see here tracks the trajectory of a particular type of cyber criminal, normally those who are young, and how they moved from criminal entry, from criminal interest and entry to serious organized crime. And the guide really details this journey, because what it tries to emphasize in these chapters on the pathway is the necessity for early awareness raising and intervention at the stages that any individuals can become accessible to digital technology, so that we're given the same warnings that we would do for offline activities and behavior online from the first engagement. And this is a key aspect that is a core component part of the guides. So we've talked about the 4P approach, and what's been developed is a 4D approach, and this is, of course, a sister in many respects of the 4P approach. It focuses directly on cybercrime offender prevention, but what it does, it enables any organization, any government structure to actually formulate a way of approaching this problem. It's two-pronged. So it effectively is to deter and divert those on the periphery of cybercrime those on the edge of cybercrime and interested in entering by raising awareness and making them aware of the legal and life implications of taking the wrong pathway, alongside pointing them towards the opportunities within the digital world for the use of their skills and a very productive career, without the spectre of law enforcement homing in on their actual world in a negative way. And so this deter and divert aspect and focuses on putting all individuals in an informed position and directing them to the use of their skills in a productive manner. In the absence of heeding those warnings, and in alignment with some very, very core traditions I was brought up with, and which really resonates with my personal approach to cybercrime prevention. We were brought up in my community with a very prominent statement from our parents and those who were in charge of guiding us, and that was, if you cannot hear, you must feel. Effectively, you are given an opportunity to be completely aware of the implications of your actions. If you choose to not take them, then there will be a detrimental effect. And it's a really cool component of this 4D approach. Provide them with the information, provide them everybody with the opportunities. If they choose not to do that, then you must degrade and disrupt their activities online, because they have committed themselves to a criminal lifestyle, and therefore they must feel the full weight of the law. Cybercrime offender prevention is not social work. It is actually law enforcement promoting service before force. And this is very, very key. It's ensuring that we as law enforcement provide the services that we do offline through our local policing and our patrolling, and also the stuff we do in schools, talking to young people and to organizations and to parents, replicating that as best as we can online. And if they don't want to listen, then we look to compromise what they do online through attacking their profile, if they're selling criminal tools and techniques, and also making sure that we're not just arresting those at the top end of a cybercrime, but also those who are operating in the lower areas of the cyber criminal landscape. So 4D approach is to deter and divert those on the periphery of cybercrime, degrade and disrupt those committed to cybercrime, and that will formulate the strategy within the guides and the rationale for actually implementing this program. So implementation, and I'll go through this fairly quickly because it's pretty much what we do in general anyway. But the key element is here, we will actually be inserting cybercrime offender prevention into every strand of our governmental bodies. So we'll be inserting it into the legislature, so that it's directed by government as part of a national cybercrime strategy, that you have a prevention component, an offender prevention component. And then the next level through the judiciary, that the courts and the adjudicators, the judges and magistrates are fully up to speed, not just with how cybercrime manifests itself in their country and globally, but also what resources and options that they have for individuals who come to them with these skills and abilities to rehabilitate and not reoffend. We need to, and the prevention program provides them with options for building that into the judicial system. And of course, in the execution of the law, we also need to ensure that within the cybercrime units that Rob has spoken about, that we have clear prevent officers who are clear, sorry, a clear strategy that prevent officers can utilize to develop a network of interventions that align themselves not just with the identifying and the intervening of individuals, but also for building into operations to ensure that we are having a wider impact on the cybercrime community. The last one, which again falls under the government template, is departmental, because all that means will mean all those other elements will mean very little if we're not building into our structures understanding about cybercrime, pathways in and out of it. And therefore, the education and employment ministries within government are so important. We do not teach someone to be a locksmith without telling them about legislation. We cannot be teaching or allowing people to learn coding and programming without making them aware that their skills and abilities can be used for harm, and these are the implications. And the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Employments that we have in our countries can really help tailor that in those initiatives to make sure that the public are fully aware of the trajectories that engagement on the digital landscape can take you in. So this last slide will focus on effectively the conclusions and the summarizing of the offender prevention program within the guides that are being published. Because it's been mentioned by Rob about ownership of the problem, that it can't just be by law enforcement, and it's impressed very explicitly within the cyber offender prevention guide about the necessity for ownership by us all, law enforcement, parents, guardians, education system, the education systems in our country, but most importantly, businesses. And why businesses? Because it's shown that businesses can be the engine of real change in society. Businesses are the ones who are subject to the impact of cybercrime. They're the ones being hacked. They're the ones that are on the receiving end of ransomware. They're the ones who, in many respects, almost resign themselves to the fact that they have to have a contingency for dealing with this cybercrime, which is so different to offline crime. So they should be built into the picture, and the concept of digital responsibility embraces those elements. It ensures that business recognize that all those individuals that law enforcement are able to deter and divert with technical skills and abilities are more than likely to end up working in their arena. So why aren't they involved in actually identifying those skills earlier and providing resources that keeps the traffic focused on what's the best use of their skills and abilities? And the guide talks about the necessity for normalizing resources such as technical and coding clubs in every country, in every region, in every locality, the same way that you would have football clubs, QMON classes, dance classes, music teachers. We're in the 21st century, and if I was to ask anybody who is listening to us on this broadcast, where are your local coding clubs? You just stare at the screen saying, and we're in the 21st century. We need to have resources like that normalized across society and owned primarily by business. And why? Because they are the beneficiaries. They are the primary beneficiaries, and they can work with government, with municipalities, with the police prevent officers to provide those resources, so that the police and that law enforcement can then just focus on those who are committed to cybercrime, not those who almost wander into it because of the absence of interventions at the lower levels. So that effectively is where the guide talks about ownership of cybercrime, about the necessity of identifying businesses and letting them recognize that they can actually utilize capitalism with a conscience, and the two are not in opposition with each other. They can work, and has been seem to work really productively in the environmental world. Why not do it in the digital world? And there, in many respects, is the future of cybercrime prevention. This holistic, joined-up approach to approaching the problem, which is invariably seen and dealt with by law enforcement too late. We can build in a program that connects us from an individual's initial engagement and interest right across the digital landscape. There is my review of the guide. Hope you found it insightful, and it's going to realign with what Rob now talks about as we come to the conclusion of this presentation on cybercrime unit and the intervention component. So thank you very much, Rob.
Thanks, Greg. I think you'll probably agree that you can see how prevent becomes such an important aspect of this overall strategy. Some monumental points that Greg makes there, that if you try to do these things in isolation, just will not work. A very, very eloquent demonstration of why the prevent should be front and centre of your entire strategy. I'm just going to finish off with a final couple of slides. Greg just mentioned the guides. This is a little bit of an overview about the guide that I've authored, which is about establishing an effective cybercrime unit. I mentioned way back at the beginning of this broadcast that you can't do things as you have been doing. So that does mean that you've got to start looking at different ways of structuring yourself, different ways of doing things. We spoke these last sort of 20 minutes or so about strategies. Well, the guide that I've produced is aimed at being a very straightforward resource that law enforcement can come to and provide a set of suggested structures and approaches for you to take. It's very easy to follow. I've written it in a very non-technical way. I'm not a techie myself. My background is a police officer. I just happen to have worked in this world for a while. So I've been very conscious to make sure that it's not technical. So anybody with any sort of background and sort of history can understand that. And I've tried to make it as comprehensive as I possibly can to give you an end-to-end journey, really, from starting from practically nothing to developing the strategies and capabilities that you need for a cybercrime unit. Now, I've said that end-to-end, but it can be used in a modular way. So the idea being is that if you've already started a program of change, if you're already on that journey, you've already got some strategies in place, you've already got some kind of capability in place, then this guide can helpfully assist you further with giving you some thoughts around what else you might be able to do, about stuff that might be challenging around moral issues, whether you should or shouldn't be doing something. And actually, even if you've got those mature capabilities, then there should be something within these guides which can stimulate and help to sense check maybe the direction that you've gone in. Now, that last point that I make is it should be seen as a guide. You know, the last thing we want is to sit here and tell people what to do and how to do it. We are merely suggesting some what we think of sensible points as to stuff that you might want to consider. So it isn't prescriptive. It's not structured to say you must do it this way. But I'm hopeful if you read the guides, you will agree that these have been written to stimulate your thoughts and hopefully guide you in the right sort of direction that you need to go with that. So what is the brief overview of my guide? Well, as I've said, it takes you end to end. There are, I think that's 8 or 9 sections within it, which take you all the way through the journey of starting with practically nothing to taking yourself all the way through to being able to implement a full program. I shan't go through each one individual. The guides have now been produced, so they are now available via CREST and through the CREST website. I'm sure CREST will put some useful links up for you at the end of this broadcast to point you in the right direction. What I will say though is through all of those, as you'll probably see from the sort of headlines for them, is that they will cover just about everything that you can think of. I do take you right through a journey of what we did. This is a decade of mine and Greg's life, really, that we've put down on paper for you. And it's based on experience. It's based on experience of what works. It's based on the experience of being in the field and finding out that something doesn't work, so you have to do it a different way. What is successful, what isn't successful. So, you know, this is 10 years, I'd like to say, experience. Some of it may well have been painful, but that's how you learn. And so we've put this down so you can learn from maybe our mistakes at certain points, but certainly you can learn from our experience and the experience of others that have worked in this field. I think you'll agree from yourself from the bios of both myself and Greg that, you know, we have been there and done it, and we have been involved in this across numerous organisations and at various different levels for a considerable amount of time now. So I would implore you to go and read the guides. They are published, they are available via CREST, and hopefully will take you through and assist you with any journey that you're taking. So the last thing that I will say from this is good luck with wherever you are on it. If this is something that is of interest to you, please reach out to CREST or myself and Greg, and we'll be able to help you with it. Thank you very much for your time and listening today, and good luck with the future.